Hello and welcome to It's a Code You, mental health support for those working in healthcare. This is a podcast created for healthcare employees to explore not only issues relating to mental and emotional health, but also unique challenges that those working in healthcare are faced with. Your hosts are Adina Tucker, a licensed clinical social worker with Dartmouth Health, and Jennifer Hinsey, an MSW also with Dartmouth Health. Welcome back to It's a Code You. And this episode, we are going to be talking about grief. We're going to look at what is grief, what are the stages of grief, how can you move through grief, and then what happens when grief becomes a little longer than you would expect, or when it becomes a little more complicated. What does that look like? How can you recognize if that's happening to you or someone else, and where can you turn for support? So let's go ahead and jump in.
Okay, so right off the bat, let's define what is grief. So, the American Psychological Association defines grief as the anguish experienced after significant loss, usually the death of a beloved person. Notice the word usually. We also grieve relationships ending and other major life events, as well as regret for something you've lost or remorse for something you've done. Another name for grieving the loss of a loved one is bereavement. So, what can grief include? Well, it can include psychological distress, physiological distress, and thinking about the past obsessively, feeling apprehensive about the future, even. And a lot of folks are probably familiar with what is called the stages of grief. Typically, there are 5 stages of grief that are most commonly known. And we're going to get into these in a bit, but these stages are helpful in providing a framework for grief, right? So, what you might experience and the complexity of your emotions and even behaviors that come with grieving. It's important to note that not everyone will experience grief in the same way. You may not move through the stages in perfect 5 stage described order. Some might be all over the place for you. You might experience the stages simultaneously, but understanding the stages can be helpful to understanding your experience. So, the first one we're going to talk about is denial. And during denial, someone generally refuses to accept a situation for what it is. Denial is a common defense mechanism that we use to protect ourselves from something that's going to be very upsetting or uncomfortable. It's not the same thing as not understanding a situation. Having a time of denial is quite normal and it can be helpful as we begin to process our grief. So, here's a couple of examples of what denial can look like. It can look like refusing to accept the death or refusing to acknowledge the death of a loved one. It could be completely avoiding talking about it in conversation. It could also include actually saying that it's untrue.
That'll take us right into the second stage of grief, which is anger. And anger is difficult because it can feel hurtful to others who are also grieving or who have been through part of the care or support for your loved one. But it's a very natural response. It can be directed toward medical staff, yourself, your loved ones, or even the deceased person. And I feel that people who have worked in healthcare or even in hospice, things like that, are very familiar with anger. And I remember the first day I used to work in a hospital doing discharge planning. I worked closely with hospice staff. And the first day of orientation, the CEO of the hospital said, I want you to remember that you're meeting people sometimes on the worst day of their life. And that has always stuck with me and really made me take a step back and realize like sometimes people are really ticked off because something really terrible is happening to them. And just being understanding of that and compassionate. But anger can look like any one of the following. You could blame medical staff for not stopping the death. You could blame other loved ones for failing to care for the deceased in some way. You could feel angry with a higher power. You might feel angry with yourself or even blaming yourself. And you could have a loss of patience. And then the next stage after anger is bargaining. So, when we feel grief, we experience a myriad of emotions, and some of those can feel very overwhelming. Processing something that was out of our control can be difficult, and we may ask ourselves things like, what if something had been different? Right? The what ifs we get stuck in. Well, maybe this person wouldn't have died if this other thing had happened. So when we're in the bargaining stage, we may try to make compromises or agreements. Usually this stage is a little irrational. And so this is some examples of what bargaining can look like. So if I had done XYZ, then my loved one wouldn't have died. I could have done more if I had made time to be around more, or even asking God or a higher power to make the death untrue. And then if that happens, you'll be willing to do XYZ, whatever that thing is.
So now let's get into depression. We know that depression is a feeling of sadness, hopelessness, but it can occur during grief as well as any other time in life. And it's important to note that depression and grief is very similar to a major depressive disorder episode. However, with grief related depression, the dysphoric mood is likely to decrease in intensity over days to weeks and usually occurs along with thoughts or reminders of the deceased. Whereas depressed mood with a major depressive episode is more persistent and not tied to any specific thoughts. For someone who has a history of major depressive disorder, it is important to mention that going through loss and bereavement could trigger both a grief response and an episode of depression. Some common symptoms of depression for both men and women are sadness, losing interest in things that brought you joy or enjoyment, sleep issues, weight changes, fatigue, agitation or restlessness, anger, social isolation, feelings of worthlessness, or an inability to concentrate. And acceptance. Acceptance is the last stage of grief, which is when we're able to come to terms with our loss and we don't fight the grief or the reality of the situation. It's usually during this period where we will find ways to honor and celebrate the life of our loved one, and we start looking to the future and how we will move forward.
So we've covered all the stages of grief. And now we want to look at what are some things that can help you grieve? What are some things that can help you process and move through those stages? And processing your grief is not something that you can do overnight. It can feel very overwhelming, but there are things you can do and ways you can find support that will make grieving much more bearable. You can utilize resources available, such as grief counselors or therapists, grief support groups, leaning on friends and family for support. And there are other things that you can do in your daily life that can also help make the process easier, such as having a routine that you stick to each day, getting in some exercise, making sure you're eating a good diet and getting enough sleep, and then thinking of ways that you can honor and celebrate your memories and the life your loved one led can also be very healing. Giving yourself permission to experience joy, laughter, and finding new ways to do so can be healing. Often people will feel guilty for enjoying a laugh or finding joy, but those things are what heal us. And our loved ones would have wanted us to continue to live. And then taking time to learn about how you can process grief can also be helpful. And there are some different books and podcasts on grief that we can just mention briefly. So there's a podcast called Speaking of Psychology, and it has two episodes that might be worth listening to. And one specifically is on how grieving changes the brain. So it gives you the intellectual background of what grief looks like and how your body processes it. There's a book called Grief Isn't Something to Get Over: Finding a Home for Memories and Emotions by Mary Lamia, PhD. And this book explains the science behind bereavement and shows how to understand and adapt to death as just a part of life, part of the cycle of life. And then for children, there is a book called The Gift of Gerbert's Feathers by Megan Weaver. who is a PhD and also a doctor of clinical social work, and Lori Weiner. And it's the story of Gerbert the Gosling, who has fun times with his family and friends, but prepares for migration and finds a way to show his flock that he's always with them, even though he's not there anymore.
So now let's talk about complicated grief and how it's different. So, grief itself is a normal reaction to life events, right? So, when someone dies, most of us experience acute grief. We may go through a period of shock. We picture our loved one. We have thoughts of them that trigger bouts of intense feelings. But most people are able to move through grief so that it can coexist in their life. They're able to have the ebbs and flows of intense feelings through normal life as they get reminded of their loved one who has passed. As they near anniversaries or birthdays, other occasions that might bring about the memory of them. But the grief over time becomes more manageable, it becomes more time limited. There may always be a sadness, but the actual grief is not with the same intensity as it was early on. However, for some people, they get stuck in the acute grief and don't move through it. And this is what we refer to as complicated grief. Now, according to the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, complicated grief affects between 2 to 3% of the population worldwide and about 7 to 10% of people in bereavement. Essentially, they experience intense grief that lasts longer than would be expected and impairs their daily functioning. And I think that's a key thing to point out too, right? Because we don't want to clinicalize grieving and things that are normal for humans to do when we've lost a loved one. But when it crosses over into creating dysfunction, it affects your daily functioning. That is a big difference between our typical sort of grieving we might go through after someone's death and something that's actually creating a difficulty in our everyday life. And so this is diagnosed as prolonged grief disorder, which has the following symptoms. And just a note, we're also just talking about adults here. In children, the symptoms are 6 months or longer past the death. So the symptoms include the death of someone close, which has occurred at least 12 months ago. And since that death, there's been the development of a persistent grief that includes one or both of the following most days, and to a clinically significant degree, and have occurred almost every day for the past month. So, those things include an intense yearning or longing for the deceased person, a preoccupation with thoughts or memories for the deceased person. And since the death, at least 3 of the following symptoms have been present most of the days, and they've occurred nearly every day for at least the last month. So that would include feeling as though a part of themselves has died, a marked sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain like anger, bitterness, or sorrow related to the death, difficulty reintegrating into one's relationships and activities after the death. So that would look like problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, or planning for the future. Emotional numbness, so an absence or marked reduction of emotional experience. Feeling that life is meaningless as a result, and feelings of intense loneliness. These disturbances cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning, and the duration and severity of the bereavement reaction clearly exceeds expected societal, cultural, or religious norms for that individual's particular culture and context. Because remember, different cultures have different ways of grieving too, right? And the symptoms are not better explained by any other mental disorder, such as major depressive disorder or PTSD. And they can't be explained or due to the physiological effects of a substance, like a medication or alcohol, or another medical condition.
That was a lot of information, but we really wanted to make sure that people understood that there is a point in grieving where it's more than, I don't like the word normal, but normal or average grief, where you might want to get some extra support. So that's the reason for us going into all that, either for yourself or maybe you recognize it in someone that you care about. So that's why we did that deep dive into what prolonged grief disorder is. So then, now that we know, okay, what does this look like? Let's talk about what is the treatment for complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. So, obviously, working with a therapist is a great way to seek treatment. One of the specific treatment options, there's prolonged grief therapy or PGT. This type of therapy was specifically designed to help those who are stuck in their grief. And this treatment model was tested in 3 research studies funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. One was focused on older adults, and the other 2 were adults of any age. So what PGT involves is around 16 sessions. It's very kind of treatment specific with a clear focus and goals. And it uses strategies and techniques from a range of different therapeutic models. And it actually comes out of the Center for Prolonged Grief at Columbia University. CBT, which we've talked about in other episodes, cognitive behavioral therapy, has also been found to be effective in reducing symptoms. And CBT is a type of therapy that focuses on changing thinking patterns and behavior patterns. And you do that by looking at your fears and addressing them, and then using various techniques to learn how to soothe yourself and relax your mind and body. And the thinking behind it is when we change the way that we think and the way we behave, then our feelings follow suit. Another therapy is CBTI, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And that can be useful in addressing any insomnia that might be occurring, giving you bigger issues in your sleep. So that combines components of CBT therapy, but is directed specifically at your sleep routine and improving your sleep, giving you more quality sleep. And then lastly, bereavement support groups can allow for connection and support, and they allow people to feel less alone, which also can help combat that social isolation.
There are also lots of different resources out there on grief and how to handle grieving. But here are some that we've located that you might find helpful for you. First, www.healgrief.org offers virtual support groups, education and awareness, and different online programs that include virtual memorials, an online candle gallery where you can light a candle at any time in remembrance, and different ideas on how to remember your loved one, and various other things. The American Psychological Association at www.apa.org. They have a section on grief that has links to videos, podcasts, and recommended books. And the Hospice Foundation of America at hospicefoundation.org has lots of different resources and support available.
Yeah. So this is a short one, but we hope that it was full of some information that is helpful to just give you an idea that what grieving looks like. It's a normal process when you experience a loss, especially the loss of a loved one, and what to look out for if you're feeling stuck or you notice someone you love is feeling stuck, and how to point them towards some more support. So we will put all of the resources in the show notes as usual. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback, suggestions for things you'd like us to cover, you can email us at dhbhs.media@hitchcock.org. If you haven't given us a rating or review on your favorite listening platform, please do that. Also, please subscribe so you don't miss anything. And we appreciate you listening, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.